Hi, my name is Bob Keating, a member of this congregation, and I'm speaking today about living with intention, and roughly translated, I'm going to say living with purpose. And just sitting here for the service so far, hearing the songs, hearing the joys and concerns, Cecile about the Pony League, and Jed playing Take Me Out to the Ball Game, I already have purpose and meaning. So I hope that all of you out there online are able to feel that quality, that this is a place that you can belong. In speaking about purpose, because that's what I'm feeling right now up here, in speaking about purpose, my assumption is that most human beings at the core are meaning-making people of purpose and hope. And clearly in these times, worldwide, we've had some of the most challenging times. Our masks here in our congregation and our Zooming and hybrid services is reflective of that. In our country, we certainly have had some of the most divided times of politically than I certainly experienced in my lifetime. It's touchstone for me about purpose and hope for a long time, since pretty shortly after I became a member of this congregation, has been the Unitarian Universalist principles. Over the last 5 years, I've increasingly added to that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And for those who are not familiar with it, it's a document, and I wasn't very much familiar with it until my wife of 55 years, who's in the pews right now, gave me a book about the work that Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the chairperson of this committee, sort of worked it through with all the diversity to make this happen. This was in 1948 in the shadows of the war to end all wars, where nearly 85 million people died, 3% of the world's population at that point in time. And she was able to create this document, which arguably is the most important document about human rights that has ever been created. And it's a document that was signed in 1948 by 48 nations, not a single negative vote, although there were some abstentions, but even that was on 1 or 2 of the 30 articles. So this document has been signed by now 192 nations, or nearly all of the nations of the world. 7 billion plus people through our representatives have said we're in support of this. And central to it is in the first article, and you'll hear echoes of Unitarian Universalism in this, is that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. That's the first article, and if you hear anything else, just stay with that and align with our first principle of inherent worth and dignity and worth. Let me say a little and give you more flavor of the document, and then I'm eventually going to move to the place about how I use it and some suggestions that may be helpful for others, or at least I hope it might be. So you've already heard the first article, actually the first sentence of it. It ends with, everyone should treat each other in the spirit of brotherhood. So the golden rule is right there. Other articles under the so-called political and civil rights speak about life, liberty, and the security of person. No one should be held in slavery. No one should be subject to torture, cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment. No one should be subject to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. Everyone has a right to seek and enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. Clearly a central issue of late in our country. So those are the rights that you are familiar with in some degree in terms of our own Bill of Rights and our own Constitution. But remember, this is 192 nations who have agreed to this. So let me shift to the second part, and these are less reflected in our own country's documents, and these are the so-called economic, social, and cultural rights. And this is from Article 25:1. Everyone has a right to a standard of living adequate for themselves and their family, including food, housing, medical services, and the necessary social services. And the right to security in the event of disability, of illness, of widowhood, of any other things that affects your livelihood in which you cannot modify. Article 26:2. One of my favorite ones. That one's my favorite one. That's the security network. You know, you all are going to be taken care of according to the sort of the ability of the particular area that you live in. But that's the big one. That's the big one in terms of economics. Everything is in there. Education. So this is Article 26. Education should be directed to the full development of the human person and to the strengthening of a respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. It shall promote understanding, tolerance, and friendship among nations, among racial groups, among religious groups, and should further the activities of the United Nations to the maintenance of peace. So it's a very broad charge of what education should be. Far different than learning math and learning languages. And clearly that's included in other parts of it. But his is to say it's an education to learn to be in a way of welcoming and caring for each other. Very you, I would say. The last one I want to note is what I call the responsibility clause. Everyone has duties to the community. That's in there. So the rights and freedoms are there, but it also says, really, we are our brothers and sisters' keepers, and we need to do that. Allison, in her remarks, will speak about focus and balance, because we wrestle with that. I mean, how much is enough? But that will be addressed in a little bit. So the values expressed in this document, I argue, are very much simpatico, if you will, with Unitarian Universalism. Bruce Knotts, who is the longtime head of the United Nations Office for Unitarian Universalism, essentially says, and I spoke to him about that, and he says, well, I don't know exactly how I said it in this. So this is a paraphrase, is that UU values are the Declaration values, and the Universal Declaration values are UU values. So that's one way in the way in which I take the Declaration and how it is very strongly linked to Unitarian Universalism. Secondly is that John Humphrey, a Canadian Unitarian working for the United Nations in the beginning of the United Nations, was instrumental in pulling together all of the drafts from the multiple nations that composed the working committee that developed the final declaration that we have today. So he was instrumental. He was the key, he was the key pin to put it all together. So he's a Unitarian. Finally, you've already heard about Article 1 from the Declaration. It is really almost exactly linked with our first principle. So there's the connection with them. And I want to show you how I have used this declaration in my own work, in my own life. And they're in two broad ways. The first one is advocating and supporting the work of bringing forth the beloved community, or in arguably the most wide-ranging statement in our principles is the sixth principle, which says the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. That's the Unitarian Universalism, and the Declaration to me helps this along, and I'll explain. In advocating an area that I've particularly worked around is the dignity of everyone having a home. Lucia and I were just, talking about this. The idea that in this day and age, in this place, certainly in many places throughout the world, that somebody doesn't have a house. And in advocating more and more over the years, even if I don't say it explicitly, I know that this isn't my values alone. I know it isn't, values of this congregation alone, or the other groups. I see Paul out there with Granite State Organizing Project, which our church is a member of. Those values are there, but I feel like there is 192 nations behind me. 7 billion people. So think about that. Whenever you're having an issue, well, actually, is that just your opinion? Well, no, actually, it's the opinion is signed by 192 nations. Now, I'm being a little, silly and, with it, but it really does come home to me in that way. This isn't something I made up, and it isn't something that I need to debate in some ways. Now, sadly, all the nations of the world, including our own, have not lived up to the ideals, just as us human beings. I mean, I got a whole video of things that I didn't live up to my ideals, and not just a long time ago, but it's there. And this declaration has resulted in about 20 important international laws, including the rights for women, the rights for children. So it is very real about what's happened. Much good has come from this, and it's continuing to being referred to as we evolve as human beings out there in the world. So that's the broad one in terms of advocacy. You have the voices there. There is the backing for these things about bringing forth a world that has enough for each person. Enough is what the concept is. The second one is closely aligned with that and is holding up, like our first principle, of inherent worth and dignity. And I begin most days by doing affirmations based on Unitarian Universalist principles and the Declaration itself of that. So that I'm constantly working on the issues that get stirred up in my own life. Because before this pandemic, we've had the viruses of suicides, domestic abuse, overdoses, and gun violence. These are not new to us, and they are not new to any of us. These sources of pandemics are many, but are fueled by gross inequities in wealth, racism, sexism, and the myriad of other oppressive ways that we treat each other at times. As I said, most of us have experienced this. I've experienced it in the impact in my life. I've spent, recently retired, over 50 years in the mental health field. I've seen it in my own neighborhood of people who have lost their lives from overdose. I've seen the losses within my own family, and I know those kind of forces within myself. So treating each other under the guidance of our second principle, justice, equity, and compassion, is an important way that I find in my own self-reflection in terms of countering these above-named oppressions and other destructive forces. For many years, I had in my appointment book a paraphrase that goes something like this: of all the services that that one can provide to humankind, I know of none other more ennobling than to heal each other of self-despising and worthlessness. Our UU principles and the Declaration itself is an antidote to self-despising and worthlessness. They affirm our inherent worth and dignity, and in the case of the Declaration, they do so by nearly unanimous consent. Remember, 192 nations. Just think of that behind you. If you're feeling kind of crappy about your life at a particular moment in time, and to say, geez, you know what? 192 nations said, there's no exceptions here. Everyone's getting included. And to me, that is the heart of Unitarian Universalism. It's universal salvation. It isn't about because, you ate 3 square meals, you didn't say a naughty word, that you picked up for yourself, you always did the right thing. It says you have worth and dignity. When I was a kid, one song from my religious tradition always touched me, which was, Jesus loves me, this I know, because the Bible tells me so. It was very, very comforting to me, as Unitarian Universalism has been to me, and as this declaration has been to me, with the very specific things that we are supposed to honor in itself collectively. So in moving toward the end, let's say that the Universal Declaration, I think, is a helpful way in expanding our message. We're about 200,000 thereabouts, Unitarian Universalists, mostly in the United States, but our values are such in line with the Declaration. I think it's a way is to continuing to expand the way in which our message goes out to the wider world. So finally, from the preamble of the Declaration that I have been speaking to you about, it says, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations, to the end that every individual and every organ of this society should keep this constantly in mind and shall strive by teaching and education to promote the respects for the rights and freedoms contained within it, and by progressive measures, nationally and internationally, to secure the recognition and the observation of these rights. I know that's a lot of stuff to put out. My poor wife has heard this el mucho times over the time, so realize that is a lot. So that's the charge that says by teaching and education to continue to promote that. And that goes a little against, we as Unitarians tend not to be missionaries. So we'll put that in a bit of the quotation. So I invite you to explore the Declaration of Human Rights. I hope it may help you and in your Unitarian Universalist call to create a beloved community. And in all of that, I hope that all of you find continuing ways to feel that you do belong here, you do belong in the community at large, and that you do have that inherent dignity and worth. So, thank you.
January is always the start of the legislative session here in New Hampshire, when all the different bills are being introduced and debated in committees. And so at this time, the organizations that we partner with are often very busy. There are multiple hearings a day and multiple bills that are worth speaking either in favor of or against. And I have to admit that I always find it pretty overwhelming. I feel pulled in all directions with requests to sign in or testify or speak in hearings for bills that speak to or against our Unitarian Universalist values. And it's hard sometimes for me to figure out where to put my time, energy, and attention. I think this is often a problem that we people of goodwill run into in our efforts to create a better world. There are simply too many problems, too many potential solutions, too many issues, and we don't have the capacity to throw ourselves wholeheartedly into every single one. So often we spread ourselves too thin, or we get overwhelmed and don't do anything at all. So intention in this case is about what helps us focus. How do we decide what to pay attention to? As Leah Morris said in her story, it's a good idea to pay attention to what we pay attention to. And I think the first question to always ask is, am I paying attention to my values, to my principles? Am I listening to what gives me purpose, meaning, and hope in the world? Coming back to your principles is one way to figure out what to pay attention to. Like Philip Moffat wrote, intentionally coming back again and again to those deepest values is what provides integrity and unity in your life. Bob just shared with us one of the things he comes back to again and again, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I wonder, what do you come back to orient your life? What do you use to refocus when the problems of the world are feeling overwhelming and are out of control? You won't be surprised to hear that for me, it is turning back to my Unitarian Universalist faith that gives me hope, meaning, and purpose in life. But you might be surprised that it isn't actually our 7 named Unitarian Universalist principles that I tend to look to. They feel too big and overwhelming to me at times themselves. There's a lot in those 7 principles. Not nearly as much as in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but more than I can quickly wrap my head around. So Bob brought it out really big for us, connecting us to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and I'm going to bring it the opposite direction, really small. When I need to remind myself of my deepest values, I turn to just 2 words that I would say sum up what we are all about as Unitarian Universalists: love and connection. These words are certainly a lot less specific and more open to interpretation than that Declaration of Human Rights or our 7 principles, but those 2 words help me center and refocus when I'm feeling unsure and overwhelmed. I ask myself, how do my actions impact all those with whom I am connected? And what does love call me to do in this moment? As we move to our closing hymn, I invite you to reflect on what it is that helps you focus and recenter. What helps you when you are feeling overwhelmed or out of control in the world? What are the things you turn to?